Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is Ukraine War Frontline Update. The first one I've done for 12 days now. It's an 11-day update. I did the mapping last night. It'll be sort of half a day update, potentially if either map has done an update. So there are a lot of pins on the map. I'd say mainly Russian advances, but actually quite a lot of blue pins as well. Let's just remind the viewers, in case you're new to the mapping updates, as to what the pins mean. There are two colours, essentially, blue and reddish pink. The blue pins suggest advances for the Ukrainians pushing the Russian defensive lines back. So this is a map that synthesizes two mappers, Surat maps and Andrew Perpetua. Andrew Perpetua has a light blue and a light pink. So light blue shows a Russian defensive line being pushed back by the Ukrainians, and the light pink suggests the Russian defensive line pushing forward and making gains for the Russians. So I will just give you more detail on that when we go to look at the first area of the map. But the dark red, or the cherry red pins suggest Surat maps thinks the Russians have advanced forward, their defensive line has pushed forward. The dark blue suggests that the Russian defensive line has been pushed back, and the pins suggest where the new line is. And for Surat maps, it's an orange line that suggests where the old Russian defensive line is. For Andrew Perpetua, the blue line suggests where the old Russian defensive line is. That sounds really complicated. It's actually really simple. Let me show you what I'm talking about by going into Sumy, and we're going to go by Tetkino. And Tetkino's seen no change. The Russians have had some momentum in pushing the Ukrainians back there. It seems to be fairly stable, no change in 12 days. But actually, we do have a change around a village called Bezalivka. I reported the other day in the Hits and Losses video that the Russians had been pushed back north of the border. Here's the Russian border. You can see it says Russia-Ukraine. There's a white line that goes along here. Surat maps has this orange line. So he is suggesting that there is no change around Bezalivka, but we have heard from many sources that Bezalivka has been cleared and the Ukrainians have taken that village back, which is south of the border. So Andrew Perpetua had this as the original blue Russian defensive line north of the border here, but then going along the border over here, and then there would be grey zone represented not on this map but on his own map, and then the Ukrainian defensive line. So what you've seen is the Russian defensive line being pushed back here, and the grey zone, you would have said that was grey zone, probably still is, but the Ukrainians have got at least somewhat in control of Bezalivka, pushing the Russian defensive line further back to around the waterworks where they were. I mean, the Ukrainians were in control of this general area here, much more so when they were in the ascendancy in Tetkino. That seems to be no longer the case. But some Ukrainian gains there, and the difference in the land that they have taken off the Russians, or the Russians do not control, is this area here. Okay, so that is the change in the Russian defensive line mapping. As we come further to the east, we can see the kind of main area where the Ukrainians are having success. No change to the mapping here. However, it does appear that the Ukrainians have had quite a bit of success here over recent periods. So there can be changes on a map for each of these mappers, but if it eats into the grey zone, it won't be represented on my map because that only shows changes to the Russian defensive line. Remember, you have a Russian defensive line, a grey zone in the middle, kind of contested area, and then the Ukrainian defensive line. So the Russian defensive line will be here. There might be a very large grey zone around here because there's active dynamic warfare going on, and then the Ukrainian defensive line back here. But it could be that the Ukrainians have actually pushed forward into the grey zone and now control more of the grey zone than they previously did, but that will not flag up on my map because we only you don't want too many lines on a map. I have the two lines of the Russian defensive line. So if we go back, say, a couple of weeks, we had Andriivka being liberated. Here we can see that Grayscale has the Ukrainians fully controlling Andriivka, and then actually taking back a large portion of land north of Andriivka with a very thin grey zone. So here we have a very thin grey zone, probably not the case with Andrew Perpetua, but that was suggesting that the Ukrainians had pushed the Russians back in this area, north of Andriivka, that they took Kindrativka. That was some significant fighting taking place there, and now they are moving on Oleksivka more and more. Here we have, so confirmation of that a couple of weeks ago. Northern direction, Sumy Oblast, northwest of Andriivka and toward Alexivka or Alexivka. The armed forces of Ukraine are conducting successful offensives against the positions of the Russian occupiers. So that's kind of what it looks like around there. Those three settlements, Kindrativka, Andriivka and Alexivka. Now, there is still talk about successes coming in there. Some small movements in Unikivka, a settlement further to the east. And then actually we have another, almost sounds the same, Alexandria here, which is near the monastery Gornal, I believe. Yeah, Gornal. This is the area of Kursk Oblast, where the Ukrainians were still tenuously holding on. They might have some presence north of the border in Kursk around here. And there are claims that they have retaken a small amount of, we're going to go back to that in a second, small amount of land south of the border, pushing the Russians back towards, over here, pushing the Russians back towards the border. So having some success in this area. You can see that corner there to the mapping. And we go here, there's that corner. So we're talking the top of that white, so this area there. So Ukrainians having success pushing the Russians back there. I did actually have another update that I'd sort of missed out there. And this is new hot off the press this morning. This is an area or a town village called Verachina, in the Sumy region that has apparently been liberated by the Ukrainians. It's not shown on any map. Actually, it's shown as grey zone by Andrew Perpetua. So the blue line here shows where the Russian defensive line is, and no doubt these areas contested, but the Ukrainians now claiming that they have retaken this village of Verachina. So that would suggest that they are looking at attacking Alexivka, or maybe the neck coming down into Alexivka from two sides there, and then cutting off the Russians there. Okay, let's move further to the east now. So some success for the Ukrainians up in the Sumy region. In fact, I don't know if I have it. No, I don't. There is a, this morning from Rilsk, I think it was Rilsk to Kuchetov there, this highway, there was a Russian convoy that was hit by Ukrainian drones. So Ukrainian drones are still operating a fair distance back from where the Ukrainian frontline troops are. Now this used to be when the Ukrainians had pushed as far north as Koronovo, a little bit further north over here. Regular FPV drones would be able to take out stuff on this highway quite regularly. Now I presume it's either different drones or drones that have similar sort of FPV but with enhanced range and whatnot. Then we have this footage coming from the Ukrainians. This is, and there are claims German to Ukraine said this is either done with an HF-1 German drone or AQ something. So he's thinking that the either options for the drone attack here are German. I'm going to just turn the sound off there. So we have a vehicle trying to cross an already destroyed bridge, then getting blown up. So on the northern Slobozhansky axis, Russian forces tried to move an artillery piece by truck across a river using a destroyed bridge. Ukrainian soldiers from the 47th Magura Brigade's reconnaissance company, working with a partner unit, quickly disrupted the attempt. Now, I've been trying to work out where this bridge is, and I think it might be, so we're going to go back to where we were. I think it's over here, north of, so very close to the kind of Gornal area that we were looking at. And I think the bridge might be just here. I think that could be the bridge that been partially destroyed already. And that could be the bridge that we see being blown up there again, or the truck on the bridge. But anyway, I could be wrong there. So that has happened. What else do we have? We have some further movement around Malove here on the border into the area of Chihunivka. So this is where are you, Malovis? Actually over here. Some claims from Andrew Perpetua that the Russians might well have control of a small area over at the border, actually taking some of their own land inside Russia back again between the two sectors, the Hliobike and the Vovchansk sectors in Kharkiv. So a bit of a rejig there possibly. And then what we're talking about is this area just up here, Chuhunivka, that the Ukrainians might well have taken some land back there, eating into the grey zone by the looks of it more than anything else. But that's where we're talking about. So just put that on the map here. That's going to be this area there that they have taken back. Okay, so now we are going. Oh, there is one more here, and I think that's what we're referring. No, we're not referring to that there. I need to just remind myself of where that was, because we have a claim that the Ukrainian fighters, as a result of successful counterattack, have driven Russian forces out of the southern sector of the Hoptivka area on the Russian-Ukraine border, and the clearing operation is still ongoing. Now, as you can see there, that is literally on the border. So the border doglegs up here along this road, and they're clearing out Russian forces from that border area. And I'm just going to fly back to where that actually is. So this is the Malove sector before we get to the northern Kupiansk area. We've got the Vovchansk, Hliobike, and then the area we're talking about just then is to the west of the Hliobike sector. And this small area here, you can see that Serebriansky Maps has that under Russian control. That's what's being cleared out by all accounts. That road along there with a settlement running along it looks like sort of industrial infrastructure really. But anyway, possibly some Ukrainian success there. Okay, then we come to the northern axis, and there are claims about Kupiansk. So Kupiansk is this city here that has been under increasing threat. As you can see, Serebriansky Maps thinks the Russians are definitely sort of in control of northern Kupiansk even, and they have pushed right in there. This has been on the cards for an awful long time. Ukrainians have held out here for a good deal of time, but it looked to be the breakthroughs where the Ukrainians, unfortunately, were unable to stop the Russians getting across the Oskil River here, and they might have used that to give them momentum to then come down from the other side of the river that passes through Kupiansk here, and that's why you have seen all of this area being taken. Surat Mapso's very different interpretation as to what's going on here compared to Andrew Perpetua, who has a Russian defensive line looking very different around that neck of the woods. But we do hear, and we're going to go to a claim from the commander of the Achilles Regiment, Fedorenko, saying that the Russians plan to occupy Kupiansk by August the 24th. Kupiansk is very important politically for the enemy. They want to show their importance, that they can actively take cities that have become a symbol of the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces. And this would be a big PR win for them if they were able to take Kupiansk. So I don't know if the Ukrainians are properly panicking about, or not panicking, but doing something about this. They do have forces to the east of there. I mean, there is an advantage here. There is, I can't, because this is Google Maps, not Google Earth. At the moment, it's difficult. I can't zoom in to show you the 3D imagery here, but this is higher ground, looking onto lower ground over there, and so they can use this to place their artillery to then have good range, go looking particularly to the east and of course to the north to some degree. But it would be a Kupiansk, as you can see, is a pretty big logistical hub there, although logistics to where if the Russians control all of this, but it will help to supply all the Ukrainian forces in this whole pocket here. So this could be fairly serious. Surat Maps has a huge chunk of land being under control of the Russians compared to 12 days ago. That's really significant if it's true. Andrew Perpetua has a massive disagreement with Surat Maps in this area, but that could be forthcoming. You never quite know. Then we hear that the Ukrainian armed forces have driven the Russians out of forest belts north of Kupiansk. This is going back a good 8 days though, but you know, this was not shown by Suriyat maps at all. See if we can get an understanding of exactly where this is. So that's a small forest area north of Kupiansk. It's going to be around here. Yeah, so this is going to be, there's the two roads coming in here, which you can see there, the two roads. Then you've got the railway coming down here, and we've seen a Russian advance along this railway as far as I can work out. So there's that forest area. I was trying to geolocate a Russian bunch of mechanized equipment coming down a railway line that got taken out. It's a double railway line. It looks like it could be around here, but I was unable to properly geolocate that. But I imagine this was the attack supposedly north of Kupiansk. Now, although this was 8 days ago, you can see that there's no change from the mapping here. So Suriyat Maps had this 12 days ago. There's no change to the mapping here in the last 12 days, according to Suriyat Maps. But N-Strike had the Ukrainians taking control of this whole area south of that forest in the grey zone and going up the railway line there. So south of the forest in that grey zone going up the railway line. This whole area here is under Ukrainian control. And actually the Russians really don't have nearly as much control as Suriyat Maps is suggesting. This is according to N-Strike, with only just this kind of pocket here under their control. So more than Andrew Perpetua had, but again, this is 8 days ago, but no change from either mapper. So it suggests, apart from some small areas down here. So this suggests that, according to N-Strike, the Russian control is around here. They don't control any of this. This is at most grey zone. If not, it's Ukrainian control. But Suriyat Maps has a wildly different interpretation there. So take these claims with a pinch of salt, and likewise any Suriyat Maps claim, but it does give you an indication. It usually suggests that that's where they've had deep reconnaissance groups attacking, or possibly even, you know, the odd, you know, mechanized attack or motorcyclists getting into a particular area. It doesn't mean they control it, but they have been seen there. And then as soon as that's the case, Suriyat Maps will paint the area in red. But the Ukrainians claiming that the Russians are trying to take Kupiansk by August the 24th. Here's the railway line. Here's exactly what it's talking about. I had put it in here for you. So here's a railway line with the Ukrainians repelling a mechanized Russian assault there. The Russians were attempting to push towards the city's left bank with 2 tanks, 3 MTLBs and about 40 troops. Coordinated actions destroyed all 5 armoured vehicles. Achilles' forces took out 1 tank and 2 MTLBs, with another MTLB damaged. I was trying to work out though, because part of me was like, is that snow? Is that actually a video that's not, or is it chalk? Because there are chalky areas around here. If you look at these embankments down there, they seem to be fairly chalky. So it's likely that you've got chalky earth there. But anyway, that seemed to be coming down this railway track, but I can't guarantee it's that one. It could be somewhere else. It talks about the left bank, so I don't know if there's another railway that goes up through this area here. But anyway, that's, you know, some evidence of the Russians trying to attack using mechanized equipment in the area and not being particularly successful there. Then we are going to come down the map to an area just around Zeleny High. We got some Ukrainian success around there, around Lazova. This is an area where the Ukrainians were having some small successes previously, pushing the Russians back in this pocket. You got Zarizhove and Kuliakivka there. This is where the Russians have got to the Oskil River. So the Oskil River comes through Kupiansk. It comes down all along here. This is the only area they've got up to the Oskil River other than in Kupiansk. And the Ukrainians have been pushing back slowly in this pocket here, grinding away at the Russians there, having some success around Lazova. Previously, it looks like they've had a tiny bit of success there again. So that's good news for the Ukrainians. Then we're going to come down to Novahayarivka. It's not noted on the map here. It could be some success into the grey zone for the Ukrainians. But N-Strike says the Ukrainian armed forces have advanced north of Novahayarivka. So that's this small settlement there, that they have actually retaken some ground basically here. You've got the road going up there. Let's see if we can see that again. Oh no, wrong place. Yeah, it looks like, yeah, can't see the road. It's not listed on there. But anyway, that's Novahayarivka, and some success in that neck of the woods. Okay, the next port of call is going to be, I think, the Torska-Terny front in Rydkodob. Yep, that's exactly where we're going to go. Actually, Armed Forces of Ukraine, successful attack south of the village of Frakivka. So some success there, which is here. So before we get to Rydkodob, some success for the Ukrainians possibly here, maybe again in the grey zone. The Armed Forces of Ukraine, through successful counterattack, advanced south of that village and drove the Russian forces out of captured strongholds. So it looks like in that particular area, the Ukrainians have countered. And we have sort of mixed bag of nuts here, with both mappers indicating different things. So first of all, we're going to go to Rydkodob, where the Ukrainians, again, for some time have been having some success around here, pushing the Russians back. Seems to be fairly heavy fighting right in the center of this village of Rydkodob. And according to Surat maps, the Russians having control north and south of there. So it would be odd if the Ukrainians were just punching through this village to be surrounded on three sides. So I would suggest that Surat maps is probably incorrect in thinking the Russians have control right as far west as they do here. If you look at, say, this particular map, you know, the Russians don't seem to be, I don't know, it's difficult because it doesn't go so far up, but yeah, it's definitely an odd shaped map here. But Ukrainian fighters have driven Russians out to the eastern part of the settlement of Rydkodob. Obviously quite a bit of drone footage coming from there, and counteroffensive actions by Ukraine's 3rd Army Corps in Rydkodob in the Liman sector. The assaults involve the 2nd Mechanized Battalion as well as the 1st and 2nd Assault Battalions. So they are putting some effort into taking Rydkodob. That is happening. Then when we come further south in this whole, and I never know quite what to call this sector, it used to be the Terny and Torska center, but Terny's all the way over there. Torska's right down here. We have a difference of opinion. So Andrew Perpetua suggests that in the last 12 days, the Ukrainians have actually pushed the Russians back, or there's a rejig in the map where the Russians do not control this area. Surat Maps, on the other hand, says the Russians have increased control. So both mappers saying the complete opposite here, and that the Russians have moved quite substantially forward in that area. Then the same can be said around the Bilohorivka area, Kolodjazy area. This is west of Terny, and they both disagree about what's going on in Terny. Here, Andrew Perpetua had that as grey zone. Surat Maps has that firmly under control and has had for some time. But Andrew Perpetua has the Russians being pushed back here. Surat Maps has the Russians pushing forward here. So again, completely different interpretation. And the same can be said around Torska, where, as you can see, Surat Maps has a massively different interpretation of what's going on here. All of this land there is a difference of opinion between him and Andrew Perpetua. Andrew has the Russians controlling this particular area, but actually not anymore. So has the Russians been pushed back? This entire sector there is now no longer under Russian control, as their line, forget those are glitches. This is a defensive line for the Russians. It does not anymore include this area there, whereas Surat Maps is going the other way and has the Russians now controlling the entirety of Torska, the town, and then moving into Zaparisia here. So really different opinions as to what's going on there. Okay, if we look at a couple of sources from the area, so we're going on to Torska here. This is a claim that the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back, counterattacking in Torska in the Liman direction. And another mapper here says similarly, with recourse to drone footage of Ukrainians in trenches up there. So if we can put that on the map, I think this looks like right in the Torska area. Just trying to work out where those trench lines were, but yeah, not 100% sure, but it looks like it's in this area that the Ukrainians have had some success. Yeah, so what we want to look at is this light field there, that rectangular light field there. If we go to these other mappers, that's Dobropilia. This light field is there. So north of there you have grey zone, and the Ukrainians are pushed right up there, sort of northwest of that field. Here we have that light field there, and Ukrainians pushing north up there. So let's say that light field here, and the Ukrainians pushing up into here. So this whole area there is under Ukrainian control. It's been retaken as according to these other mappers. As you can see, right up into there, and the Russians having control of only a small area over here. Probably more in line with what Tourette Maps did have, but now Tourette Maps has changed this whole area to being in control of the Russians. Okay, so there is that. Now we're going to come on to, first of all, we're coming on to the Serebriansky forest. We have Dobropilia here. That was fought over during a lightning counteroffensive. There seems to be fighting over that area again now, or at least south of it. Fighters of the Ukrainian Armed Forces 53rd Brigade liberated several positions south of Dobropilia. So I presume that is going to be somewhere around here, but it's hard to geolocate in the forests so much. Actually, no, what we're talking about. So you see this kind of orangey area with the white in there. So that's the orangey area there. So the Ukrainians retaking an area just south of that, which is to say that the Ukrainians are controlling, this area here. So the Ukrainians have retaken that. Tourette Maps, on the other hand, has the Russians pushing the Ukrainians right back here. So again, difference of opinion with the other mapper we we're just referring to. This is End Strike, and yeah, massive difference of opinion, as well as differing from what Andrew Perpetua says. Now, although Tourette Maps was more charitable to the Ukrainians back in this area, they've now changed for the Russians having huge amounts of control all in the Serebriansky forest. A bit of a change here, a bit of a rejig probably, having the Ukrainians seemingly completely cut off in this pocket. Tourette Maps has the Russians controlling, had the Russians controlling all of this area, and then either the Ukrainians countering or not being true in the first place. Then we have just complete pin chaos around here. That I don't know whether some of these are glitches or whether Andrew Perpetua's changed control of this whole area here. So I'll need to check that out on his map. Sometimes the automation for picking up the pins has a bit of a funny moment, but it looks pretty chaotic around the Serebriansky forest. It looks like the Russians, if Tourette Maps is to be believed, Russians really pushing hard in the Serebriansky forest. This was an area that the Ukrainians were actually having some success previously. And then we have the move towards Seversk through Bilahorivka, the Russians having more success there, moving towards the town of Serebrianka. But again, take that with a pinch of salt. Huge difference of opinion between the mappers in that area too. Okay, so that's the end of that axis, the kind of Kupiansk to Crimea, Serebriansky forest. We're going to now come on to sort of Chasiv Yar, but first of all, there were claims actually from the Russians. Do I have this here? No, there were claims from the Russians that they had taken control of 2 settlements, but both settlements were settlements that they supposedly already have had control of. So one of them is Ivano-Dorivka, and they announced that they had taken Ivano-Dorivka. Well, as you can see, they've had that for at least 12 days. In fact, that's been a long time under Russian control. There's not a lot here. I've talked about Ivano-Dorivka previously when the Ukrainians were all the way back down here around Berestova, and then the Russians suddenly ended up being in Ivano-Dorivka. They had some drone footage of them being there, but you couldn't tell whether they're Russians or Ukrainians actually, and whether they just kind of run into the village, taking a picture and then run out, because this is all very difficult terrain and not, you know, I often talk about how you know whether a particular side controls terrain when they're just fields. I mean, do you have to have people standing there with flags to say we own this field? Like, what does it mean to control like vast areas around here when actually there's probably no humans in those areas? So, you know, take these lines with a pinch of salt. They are kind of rough approximations to some degree in many of these places. But we're going to come on down to Chasiv Yar, where, as you can see, complete chaos again with pins. But actually blue pins for Andrew Perpetua, showing that the Ukrainians might well have been pushing back. Claims that the Ukrainians have had some success in Orikhovo-Vasilivka up here, which is signified here. The Ukrainian armed forces have advanced as end strike in the area of Orikhovo-Vasilivka, just to the east of that settlement, which is under Ukrainian control, as according to end strike. So that's generally accepted there. That's up here. So some success pushing in this kind of pocket there. Actually further to the east, so actually over here. So the Ukrainians having success there. Andrew Perpetua actually going the other direction, saying that has just been closed off now, potentially. I'd need to check his map, but it is a bit of confusing lines around there. But this end strike claim was from August the 13th, so that's now 3 days ago from when I did the mapping. Okay, right, then Andrew Perpetua seems to suggest that Ukrainians have either pushed the Russians back here, or the Russians never really controlled that area, although on the other hand, Surrey Maps claiming that the Russians have taken a tree line and some fields further to the west. So, you know, again, who knows quite what's going on here. If you look at the difference between these lines, the orange line is where Surrey Maps thinks the Russians are. Andrew Perpetua has his blue line. Chasiv Yar, very different opinions there, and that's importantly around Stabilization as well. Like, if the Russians really do control it, all of this land down to Predtechny, then that's knocking on the door of Konstantinivka, right? If they don't, if Andrew Perpetua is correct, then that's a really, really different interpretation of what's going on, and that will inform, you know, how vulnerable Konstantinivka really is. Surat Maps also then has the Russians either being pushed back or never being in control of some areas to the east of the Donetsk canal here. So yeah, there's a canal as it comes down here. Remember, they were fighting over that. Remember Klishchivka, so much talk about Klishchivka, Andriivka and Kupiansk there. Wow, that seems like an age ago, doesn't it? And then we come down, yeah. So, Russian forces continue to advance to Chasiv Yar, said end strike, but this is going back a goodness me, 20 days now. Russian forces were then in control of 90% of the city, but it could be that the Ukrainians, I don't know, there doesn't seem to be a lot of change in Chasiv Yar itself. But interesting developments around Konstantinivka. We're talking about Tourett and New York. Quite a bit to be said about this area. Here was two of the claims. So one was the village of, so Russian forces captured the villages of Chasiv Yar, southwest of Dobropilia, and Ivano-Dorivka, located northeast of Sloviansk. Well, Ivano-Dorivka, then this is August the 16th, so this is yesterday. Well, that's been under Russian control, according to the mappers, for absolutely ages. And Chasiv Yar 2, which is around here, we'll find that in a second. But yeah, a couple of these Russian claims are just like weirdly behind the times, because, you know, the Russians, it appears, have been in control of those settlements for an awful long time. Now, as you can see here, north of Touretsk, north of Delivka and Dachna. We have around Bilahora the Ukrainians pushing the Russians back there, as according to Andrew Perpetua. And on the other hand, we have Syrian maps having the Russians advancing forwards. So, what's going on there? Some either rejigs or Ukrainian counters in the northwestern sector of Touretsk and in this place called Serebriansky, which is being very, very strongly fought over. But then, Syrian maps has the Russians way further north at Katianivka and controlling vast amounts of territory over here. Whereas, Andrew Perpetua has the Ukrainians either pushing back the Russians in some of these places or a rejig of interpretation of what's going on. So there are claims from Grayskull, and this is going back some time, that Yablonivka was being fought over. So that is over here, fighting around there, but that's some time ago now. We're going to go to Playfra that talks about Serebriansky being and Katianivka. So the Russians are trying to find a way to capture Katianivka. Again, this is going back 18 days, but it just shows you how long it does take them to take these places and how tough it is for both sides. And they continue infiltrating Serebriansky and Petrivka. In the fields between the Terekon and Delivka are some new Russian casualties. So there are a number of places being talked about, Delivka and the Terekon, so in this area. And then we have Serebriansky and Katianivka over here. The Russians are desperately trying to take both of those. And then more recently, Serebriansky, this was August the 9th, so now going back 8 days. The Russians have practically captured the settlement, with only some contested areas remaining in the northernmost parts of the settlement near the river and railway. Right now, the situation is still chaotic and everything will become clearer in some days. The Ukrainians are slowly retreating to the line where they can plan to make a strong stand before Konstantinivka. That's a reservoir, and that'll be around here, that kind of line. But Andrew Perpetua then has the Ukrainians pushing back in Serebriansky. So, this is quite a built-up area. There'll be a lot of urban fighting. It's difficult for the Ukrainians to get their supplies into their troops here because the Russians have the drone advantage, it appears, have had for some time around here, and the Ukrainians are only managing to resupply using their own drones rather than trucks or anything like that. That's absolutely not going to happen. So really difficult for the Ukrainians in the Serebriansky area. Okay, claim on Molau. No, so then we're going to go all the way down to the Pokrovsk area. Right, so before we get there though, just understand, I say down, actually across, understand that, there are quite a few differing opinions as to what's going on right across this front line. That's Chasiv Yar that we're talking about, that the Russians said that they've just taken control of. Well, actually, they've been in control of that for at least since we last mapped here, so that's 12 days ago. Just, kind of bizarre. Anyway, I wonder if they say that just to announce just town names, so they can say, look, we control somewhere that we'll pretend we didn't control before, and it gives them brownie points with their command. But as you can see around here, my goodness, chaos. Who knows actually what's happening there? Both mappers say the opposite, that the Russians are advancing as according to Surat maps, and the Ukrainians are advancing according to Andrew Perpetua. So we're going to leave that one for now, see if there's any clarity in the next mapping update. Then we come to these two rabbit ears. So this is where the Russians had the very supposedly kind of scary, this has been interpreted in so many different ways, deep reconnaissance groups getting really far back into Ukrainian territory, right to where the actual hardcore defensive lines for the Ukrainians are. I think they go something like this. So the Ukrainian main trench does something like that. I don't know. And that's the last kind of big one. And there are loads of sort of little trenches. I'm making this up, by the way, to some large degree. But they penetrated all the way through here to the large trench lines. And if they'd done that and when they're able to clear, along each direction of that trench, and then that is the Ukrainian big old fortifications completely negated. So this was genuinely a problem for the Ukrainians, because if they were then able to send in exploitation troops, because these were only people using sort of thermal coats and whatnot, crawling for many days, getting behind the lines, supposedly special forces, but if they were then able to load loads more troops into there and mechanized equipment, this then becomes a problem. So that was then, there's a huge reaction to this, where the Ukrainians sent in parts of like 6 different brigades and recognized that there was a huge problem there. So Clement Mollin says, after bringing in reinforcements and being able to contain the Russian breakthrough, Ukrainian troops counterattacked and managed to push back the Russians. Ukraine has taken back control of the new Donbass line. So this is that trench line that I was talking about effectively. It was not a secret to anyone, a secret anymore, as the excellent Thorkill reported. Ukrainian forces started counterattacking 2 days ago. Yesterday in the morning, so this was already a day ago, this thread, so 3 days ago from now. Yesterday in the morning, they took back control of Zloty Kolodiaz and pushed the Russians back behind the new Donbass line. So here we have that new Donbass line, that defensive line, I would have thought. That was just south of Zloty Kolodiaz, as I said, so it went through there. There are different interpretations of what the Russians controlled, or whether they actually ever controlled it. They were just there, but nonetheless present, but being pushed out of Zloty Kolodiaz. And then moving on, a video published yesterday by Ukraine's 93rd Brigade shows them engaging Russian soldiers from the 132nd Brigade in Vesele, 12 kilometers from the previously known front line. In the process, they captured some Russian soldiers and attacked them with UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles. So this is 12 kilometers, as Vesele up there, 12 kilometers behind the previous front line, which would have been back here. So that's obviously a big challenge for the Ukrainians there. And if we now continue, many people and analysts continue to blame the ones who warned of the situation, saying there was no evidence and it was not catastrophic then. They should explain why Ukraine had to deploy in urgence multiple brigades and army corps, and why Deep State made this map. And that's one of the Deep State maps, one subsequent to the successful counterattacks by the Ukrainians. But it's absolutely right. If it wasn't so bad, why were there elements of 6 different units sent in? And these are really good units. So, but I would actually say it wasn't so bad if you did that. They did that, therefore it's all right. You close them down, and they were mainly DRG and isolated troops, but they were starting to pull in mechanized equipment and more troops, which you can see by the admission of the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians have now announced that they have, due to active operations in the Corps' area of responsibility, the enemy suffered significant personnel losses. Irrecoverable losses, 271, sanitary losses, 101, so killed 271, wounded 101, captured 13. So we are now talking a lot more troops. The enemy also lost a significant amount of equipment and weaponry, destroyed and damaged 1 tank, 2 armoured fighting vehicles, 37 vehicles and motorcycles, 3 artillery pieces. Now, if you're getting artillery pieces nearby to there, then you are starting to get mechanised equipment in there. 1 tank. Okay, this isn't a lot of mechanised equipment really at all. You've lost 1 tank and 2 armoured fighting vehicles, 37 vehicles and motorcycles. And what this shows is they're attacking mainly with motorbikes, SUVs and whatnot, light vehicles, get them up quickly, buggies and whatnot, and then establish a foothold and then get your heavier equipment in. And it was at that key time that the Ukrainians pushed back and managed to stop the Russians. So everyone's a bit right here. It was a huge problem, but you didn't have established huge Russian units there, but they were trying to get there, and the Ukrainians hit them at the right time to take them out. However, one of the most important developments is the liberation of Nikianorivka and Dorozhnya. Dobropilia is safe again, and the destruction of Russian DRGs north of Pokrovsk, particularly between Rodinsky and Belitske. As stated, they should now push until the river to be safe. Now, what they're talking about here is coming back down to this area. So Rodinsky The Russians have got across a river over here and then been pushing uphill, getting towards Rudinsky, and it's around here that I think he's talking about what the Ukrainians need to do is stop the advance north of Pokrovsk, so it's completely surrounded. Really, obviously, Ukrainians want to completely rid the entirety of Ukraine of the Russians, but essentially, what they want to do is push the Russians right back to, if I can get the correct color, right back to there. Again, like, all of this is a really big problem, obviously, for Pokrovsk. It's difficult enough trying to keep the Russians at bay around here, but if you're allowing them to get into the north here, then you are operationally, effectively, functionally surrounded. They'll have fire control over these kind of roads through drone usage. You just need to push the Russians back. So this is where it starts, and that starts with cutting them off over here, which appears to have happened, and pushing them back and using those 6 units really to regain control of this entire area there. I mean, I assume they're not just going to give up once they've taken back this salient up here, this bridgehead there. I presume they're going to help to clear the whole area, but who knows? The urgency is now to fill the holes in the new Donbass line anti-tank ditches, because Russian forces may be coming back sooner or later. Was the situation that catastrophic? Yes. Russian unit broke through the front line and advanced around 15 kilometers to the point they crossed. Sorry, I need to go back. It's annoying that Twitter does this. They crossed on foot all major obstacles. They managed to temporarily cut the Dobropilia Kramatorsk road and threaten all the central part of Donetsk Oblast front. So you can see that defensive line, the last big defensive line, was compromised. So, it was, I don't know if it's catastrophic, but it was on the verge of being catastrophic. We can acknowledge a very rapid and good reaction from the Ukrainian leadership. Sersky has assault groups. Instead of attacking Tetkino and Kursk Oblast, they should rather be used to contain Russian progress and push them back when possible. And it could be why you've seen no change in Tetkino for a good few weeks, because they've realised that, hey, what's really the point of taking Tetkino? Ukraine is, it does have some value. I've talked about that previously, but not as much as the value for not losing this ground here. Ukraine is obviously lacking men in the front line, but not necessarily behind. The war is not lost, and facing a superior enemy is very difficult. The positional warfare, we know, is slowly switching to a chessboard game where positions of both sides are mixed. Situation remains very difficult for the Ukrainian forces. This counterattack may have depleted other fronts, and Russians are still making progress elsewhere. I continue to monitor multiple new airstrikes, he says, from falling every day in the front line and making it difficult to hold the line. So he does this airstrike map where you can see, it's almost like a heat map of what's going on, and shows you where each side is, really focusing on. But anyway, there you go. We'll leave that there. I think that's a pretty good synopsis of what's going on. The Ukrainians have pushed back, and they are pushed back the Russians and even cut Russians off. And they are hoping to push back so that this entire bridgehead is taken out. And the question, as I've just said, is, do they continue? I'd assume they will. So this is the footage that was already referenced by Clément Molin, which is that Ukrainian soldiers from the Chasiv Yar brigade released footage of clearing operations in the Dobropilia area where they stopped and blocked a Russian breakthrough. The unit regained control of Hruzke and Vesele using reconnaissance drones, artillery and ground combat robots. What we have seen around here as well is evidence that the Ukrainians have used UGVs with machine guns, maybe even grenade launchers, to help in their kind of combined arms maneuvers, as we are successfully seeing throughout the course of this war the substitution of humans with robots. Or drones. UAVs are replacing frontline troops, so aerial drones, and then UGVs are replacing troops in certain situations where they are needing to retake land. Okay, good news. The official report of the Ukrainian General Staff for August the 4th to 16th, following the start of the local counteroffensive in Dobropilia direction, Hruzka, Rozbizhnya, Novovodzyanie, Petrivka, Veseloya, and Zloty Kolodzanie Kolodyazi, the city of Pokrovsk, they've been liberated. City of Pokrovsk has been completely cleared of the occupiers, reconnaissance and sabotage groups. Okay, so that's to say a number of these places, so here, there, Vesele, Hruzhka, these places have been liberated, and here as well, and that they have cleared out the Russians that had infiltrated into Pokrovsk as well, and even got into civilian clothes as well, according to many claims. So the Russians have been pushed back in a number of key places, according to the Ukrainians. Occupiers' losses are now 910 killed, so this is now a wider area for these stats. 335 wounded, 37 captured. It's 8 tanks destroyed, 6 armoured combat vehicles, 103 cars and motorbikes. Shows you the proportion of what equipment is being used, isn't it? And 1 MLRS, multiple launch rocket system, destroyed. Just yesterday, 6 occupiers were taken prisoner in the area of responsibility of the Ukraine's 19th Territorial Defence Corps. Stabilization operations continue in the Dobropilia direction. So you can see what they are doing there. Their interpretation, the Ukrainians have, or the Russians have not pushed up to this road, Belitsky, Rudinsky there. So that is that they aren't across this road at all. And in fact, they're back here. So Surrey Maps has, again, a very different interpretation to what everyone else is claiming. Interesting around here for Andrew Perpetua that Ukrainians are now in control of this pocket, or the Russians aren't in control of that pocket around Mykolaiivka there. Okay, so I think that does it for the Pokrovsk area. Very good news as reported earlier today. Following successful counterattacks, the armed forces of Ukraine have liberated the settlement of Razina on the Donetsk front in the direction of Myrnohrad. It appears that Ukrainian forces have deployed reserves and launched active defensive operations along the Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad line, aiming to repel Russian units through the tactical counter-destructive counter-offensives and to neutralise the threat of possible encirclement. So that is going back some time though, but that was in the Razina area, so that's over there. So, you know, they're being consistent, like back and forths over there. So we're going to come down past Pokrovsk, and although Surrey Maps seems to suggest that the Russians are making advances in these areas, we have to question that to some degree. We're going to come down to an area of Dachny, and actually is it Horikove as well. So as we come towards the end of this sector, what do we have? Malivka. We had heard about this previously, Ukrainians retaking Malivka. And here we go, Dachny and Andriivka Klevtsove. Okay, so here we have about 8 days ago that Ukrainians attacking in Dachny, retaking some land there. Well, actually, Andrew Perpetua has quite a large area of land coming back under Ukrainian control, or at least not Russian control. And then a very big difference of opinion around this area further along by Yalta. So again, who knows exactly what's going on? Surrey Maps is saying that there's a very positive outlook for the Russians, including taking Andriivka Klevtsove. But actually here, this source says from yesterday, big news as a result of successful counterattack on the Donetsk front and the Novopavlivka direction, the armed forces of Ukraine have regained control over this settlement. So Andrew Perpetua probably thinking this is dynamic, no point having the Russians controlling it because it could change. It's not robust control, and indeed that's probably correct. The Russians getting into there, the Ukrainians pushing them out of there, and we're left kind of where we started. This is Malivka, the area that was reported some time ago. It was reported that Ukrainians had retaken. I think I reported that in a previous video, maybe my previous frontline updates. I think that was already in place then. But anyway, there you go. With Surrey Maps having, you know, fairly widespread gains across this front, according to the Russians, but pinch of salt and all that. Okay, then we have some Ukrainian gains around Drozhnyanka. There, just a very small amount south of Heliopole. We're going to close down that group and now come onto the southern front line, where we're going to finish up here. So yeah, no no claims from other sources about anywhere along here until you get to Malotok-Kamachka. You can see a really big difference of opinion around here as well. Serebriansky has the Russians much further north and the Ukrainians much further to the south. Andrew Perpetua, less charitable for the Russians. There's been some activity around Malotok-Kamachka. Ukrainian forces repelled another large-scale mechanized assault by the Russians in Malotok-Kamachka. The assault began with the Russians moving heavy equipment. This is back only 3 or 4 days ago, from Verbove straight across the fields, followed by Russian motorcyclists attempting to break into the village via the road from Novopokrovka. In the end, the attack failed. Russian losses: 1 tank, 4 buggies, 4 motorcycles, damaged infantry fighting vehicle and an APC, 16 soldiers killed and 10 wounded. So they appeared to have, and this was the site really of the counter-offensive from the Ukrainians in the May 2023 period onwards, where they were trying to assault down through Robotina, down to try and reach Tokmak. They were hoping to go 30 kilometers a day. This was Valery Zaluzhny making a big mistake, possibly because of the pressure from Western forces, but I'm not sure that basically they split forces between Bakhmut and here and attacked in the strongest area possible. I mean, you know, Sun Tzu always, I mispronounced that anyway, always says, you know, attacking the weakest point, don't attack at the strongest point, and the Ukrainians attacked at the strongest point, and it was a bit of a nightmare. It didn't get so far, and that's when they realised, oh my goodness, we need to take out artillery, and we need to take out air defences, and we need to, so they then spent the rest of the time massively attriting Russian artillery and air defences. And you would think, goodness me, if they had a chance now to have the troops and equipment they had back then, where would they attack? Because actually they've done a better job of degrading. Okay, so Malotok-Kamachka has seen some action. Then we are going along to Stepnohirsk, and here the Zaparisia reservoir, which as we zoom in fills with water, but we know that's not the case. We have a lot of activity taking place in Kupiansk, and then also north to Stepnohirsk, which might not have been fully under Russian control, but the Russians had got that far north at some point. So soldiers of the 210th Separate Assault Regiment of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, as a result of successful counterattack, this is going back 20 days, drove out the Russian forces from the village of Stepnohirsk. So we've seen this gradual pushback of the Russians around the Kupiansk area, and there are differing claims as to what's going on, that the Ukrainians have counterattacked. So I think it's quite dynamic. So it could be that Ukrainians retake ground in Kupiansk and then it gets retaken again. So for example here, August 2nd, Ukrainian advance in Kupiansk, Zaparisia direction. So you can see that's, you know, coming in, taking this land there, but then it might be retaken because we've had an awful lot of claims that look very similar to this. August 8th, Ukrainian forces have broken through into the northeastern part of Kupiansk. Preliminary reports indicate that they have already established positions there, as the enemy claims the AFU are pressing on their lines from these positions. However, more precise frontline details are still being clarified. So that's to say that really they're in here, but the mapping does seem to change quite a lot in this area, because we had claims that the Ukrainians had retaken areas down around here and all along here. And as you can see, Andrew Perpetua and Surat maps unsurprisingly disagree on who controls what here. But you know, the Russians still control all this area up to the causeway, right along the rivers, the river bank, the right-hand bank of the river. Anyway, so it's fairly dynamic around there. Here's another map to suggest that the Ukrainian assaults are driving the Russians out of eastern Kupiansk there. And look here, the Ukrainians control all of those gridded roads here. Well, that's not what Surat map says. So, you know, a lot of difference of opinion here, but there's tough fighting in Kupiansk, that's for sure. And as there needs to be, because if you allow the Russians to get purchased there, then they start walking themselves up the edge of the reservoir, and look what's next, Zaparisia. So you do not want the Russians to get close enough to start shelling Zaparisia with artillery. So it's really important that the Ukrainians contain the Russians here. And there are some claims that the Russians are seeking to advance there. Zaparisia is supposedly an area where they are amassing troops to attack. Could be Malotok-Kamachka, Orikhiv, Heliopole, and Kupiansk seem to be the three kind of major options for the Russians there. But as of now, you know, no breakthrough and no huge amassing of troops that looks anything like a proper sort of huge offensive. Anyway, that's enough from me. You've heard me whittle on for too long. It's been almost an hour, but this is a 12-day update, so what do you expect? Thank you for watching. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.